Welcome to Inside the Birds. Our big game coverage is presented by Green Lawn Fertilizing. We're very excited to have Green Lawn Fertilizing on board to bring you guys all of the birds coverage leading off to kickoff. Hello, welcome to a special edition of Inside the Birds. I'm Jeff Mosher, and we're really excited to bring on a guest for this because we've done so much coverage of the Eagles from an X's and O's and on-field standpoint as they get ready to play the Chiefs for the second time in 3 years in the Super Bowl LIX. We're going to bring in our analytics expert, Sam Finkel. Now, if people are not yet familiar, any new listeners with Inside the Birds who are not yet familiar with Sam has done an excellent job of being our analytics reporter. Sam has built an actual algorithm by himself that helps him determine NFL contracts when it comes to free agency, which we've published on our website, InsideTheBirds.com, for the last 2 years. Sam has written a lot of analytics and data-driven articles on InsideTheBirds.com. He's also been a assistant quarterbacks coach at Penn State. And part of that job was being responsible for analytics projects. So Sam is a fantastic resource for us on analytics, on data, and he's done a lot of work for InsideTheBirds.com that is data-driven and that we always get great feedback with. So Sam, it's great to have you. You have done a yeoman's job again, and you've done this in the past for us 2 years ago when the Eagles were in the Super Bowl against the Chiefs, to break down the game from an analytics standpoint. So what we're going to do here with your help is do a two-part series. And this is just going to be the beginning because you and I have talked and we're excited about this. Once the season's over and things slow down and we get into free agency and we get into the draft where you've done work for us before, we are going to have you start doing more analytics-based podcasts. I hope you're excited about that.
Very excited. I'm excited to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's great. This is an area of Inside the Birds that we want to expand and we want to get into more, and it's really looking at things from an analytics side. So let's start with part one. We're going to do a two-part series. Part one, we're going to compare who the Chiefs are to who the Eagles are this year, right? And then not only how they are, what they are good at, what their strengths and weaknesses are, but then we're going to look at it based on common opponent. And for those who are listening, there's going to be a lot of visual element probably that could help them. This will also put your work on InsideTheBirds.com as we always do. So if you're wondering after you listen, wait, I forgot how these things compare, that'll be there on the website for everybody to see. And honestly, Sam, if I was tech savvy enough, I probably would just do a share screen and have it on as we spoke. But I don't want to distract people from what you're going to say, right? People can go to the website and read your work there. And that's a good way to sort of get people to look at it visually and get familiar with your work.
I definitely think it's worth checking out, though. So if you're listening, definitely take a look.
Absolutely. So the two-part series we're going to call the analytics story of the 2025 Eagles. And, of course, they're playing the Chiefs. So this is a game that was very close and then decided, obviously, much to the chagrin of Eagles fans two years ago by a field goal after a holding penalty. But, Sam, these teams are not the exact teams. Of course, there's always change, but even philosophically who they are, what they do, there are some differences. So when you started off and you did your comparison of Eagles offense versus the Chiefs defense, right? And then the Eagles defense versus the Chiefs offense, what in particular stood out to you? Let's start with Eagles offense versus Chiefs defense in this matchup.
Before we do that, I just want to say that the methodology in which we used, I think it's important to always let everyone know how we decided to do this. So what we did and what I did for you previously is I just looked at the regular season. Well, I don't think that tells the complete story of the Eagles or the Chiefs for that matter this year. So what I did was I went through every regular season and postseason game, but obviously that would skew the numbers. So what we did was we took that and we did it per game. So every output is per game to account for the extra games that both teams played. So that being said, the Eagles offense, what is not very surprising, was the second most rushing yards per game of any team in the NFL. Only the Ravens were number one with 183.4 rushing yards per game. So obviously a big strength of this team, which again is a very obvious thing, is the rushing attack. Um, the next strongest thing of what we looked at was the turnovers per game. They were fourth. They had the fourth least turnovers per game at 0.75.
Mm-hmm.
After that, points for per game, which obviously was boosted, I think, because of the playoffs, most notably the NFC Championship. Points for per game was 28.4, which was sixth in the NFL. And the yards per game was seventh at 367.05 yards per game. The weakest element, and I think Jalen Hurts says it best, just because we don't doesn't mean we can't,
Mm-hmm.
was 183.65, which was 30th, which is obviously not where you want to be as a Super Bowl team. But again, I don't think they're incapable of it. They just haven't had to really rely on it as much.
Right. So as you set the table here, incorporating all the games, the Eagles basically are either top 5 or top 10 in almost every really significant category that's going to matter here, which is points, yards, turnovers, rushing yards. And the one area that we all know that they were lower in is passing yards. However, when you are the number 2 ranked rushing yard team, I think it's very difficult. And I imagine even through analytic studies, you would say it's very hard to have a top 5 rushing and a top 5 passing offense, or else you'd probably set like smash NFL records for offense in general and points scored in general.
Absolutely. There's only so much time of possession that you actually have. And so what
Mm-hmm.
you do with it, I mean, our identity has been running the ball, right? And so we really haven't gone away from that identity, and we haven't had to. And hopefully we won't in this game.
All right. Now we're going to look at how those numbers compare to what the Chiefs do defensively, and then try to make a data-based analysis on that.
Sure. So for the Chiefs, what is significant, what's most significant about the Chiefs is they limit points. They were fourth in the NFL with 19.42 points allowed per game. And that's a really significant point, and it's part of the reason they've been able to be so successful. They haven't necessarily, and we will get to it on the offensive side, they haven't put up as many points as you'd expect, especially having the Patrick Mahomes essentially at the helm. But their defense has been really good at limiting offensive points, and they're fourth in the league. It's going to be a problem. The next thing that I would say is their rushing yards per game allowed is also eighth in the league. So they've allowed 104.4 yards per game. And then also total yards and passing yards are both ranked ninth in the league at 324.26 total yards allowed and 106.68 passing yards allowed per game.
Mm-hmm.
What has been a rough point for them, they're 19th in the league, is turnovers generated per game at 1.05. And most of these turnover stats are pretty close, but the margins may be close, but it's still significant to be 19th in that. And since the Eagles are a team that doesn't turn over the ball very often and the defense doesn't generate very many turnovers, analytics should suggest that we can expect that to continue, which goes in the Eagles' favor for sure. What's going to be interesting is to see how this run defense matches up with the second best attacking run offense, which in the playoffs, they have allowed a decent amount of yards to the running backs. Notably, James Cook and Joe Mixon have done pretty well against that defense, and we hope to continue to see that with Saquon. But that'll be a really interesting battle. I think that the passing yards, they're very good at limiting, and the Eagles have not been great at generating, but they might have to this game. We will see.
Going back, and I know you don't have the 2 years ago study right in front, or maybe you do, but going back, I would imagine, well, we know that this is a lot different. We know that the Eagles had a more explosive passing offense than a rushing offense. Same thing you probably say for the Chiefs. So I wonder, when you look at the fact that the Eagles don't turn the ball over and the fact that the Chiefs don't create a lot of turnovers, do you think it almost suggests that this will be two teams that control the ball fairly well and possibly a more ball control, lower scoring affair than we got 2 years ago that ended 36-33?
I mean, the data certainly suggests that it should be lower scoring, but with the star power you have on both sides, it's hard to say. That could just be what the story, the numbers tell that, but the game still has to be played, and the game isn't played by these numbers. But I'd certainly suggest that based on the strengths and the weaknesses, that's what the numbers sort of suggest.
Right. I mean, it could certainly be. I mean, if both teams had 4 touchdown drives and this combined for 8 touchdowns, that would be a lot of touchdowns. But at the end of the day, the way both teams move the ball meticulously and deliberately, 4 touchdowns each would be 28-28. And then whoever has the ball last, maybe you win 31-28, which theory obviously would be less than the 36-33 outcome. Last game, there obviously was only 1 turnover, and that was the Jalen Hurts fumble. This game almost suggests, again, another, it almost suggests to me when I look at data with a team that doesn't turn the ball over versus a team that doesn't create turnovers, it does give me the impression that if there is a turnover in this game, whoever creates it will be the team that probably gives itself even more an advantage in the outcome.
I think you're absolutely right. So the biggest thing, it will be sustained drives. And I think that time of possession is going to be really key in this game. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the common opponent analysis. But I think really whoever holds the ball the longest and can obviously generate points off of it is going to win. And I think we've seen the Eagles do a really good job at creating long drives. And I think most notably what comes to my mind is that Steelers game where they had that 10-minute drive. If they can do that again, if they can replicate that, and if they can get the ball out of Patrick Mahomes' hands as much as possible, they stand the best chance of winning. And by doing that, you have to have these sustained drives and steal possessions.
Absolutely. Another thing jumping out to me as we transition to the Chiefs offense against the Eagles defense, you mentioned that the Chiefs have been a good defensive team this year and top 10 in all these. I see the green numbers. So for those who look at Sam's work online, he things that are good for a team, he'll put in green. Obviously, things that aren't good, he'll put in red. Well, the Chiefs defense, to the point you made before being good, is not a function of the Chiefs offense always giving them the lead and putting the other team at a disadvantage. In fact, it's the opposite. You would probably say more so now than even years ago when they had Tyreek Hill and they were throwing the ball everywhere. They are a defensive-oriented team that only asks its offense to come through in specific situational, third down, occasional fourth down, get the field goal. They have a very good kicker and help the defense out by being efficient offensively, because as we're getting into, the offensive numbers for the Chiefs are somewhat staggering when you consider the fact that they have at least 2 Hall of Famers in their quarterback and their tight end. Which of these numbers really kind of jumps out at you when you look at the Chiefs offense, Sam?
Well, I think the biggest point and the only green number we have on there is the turnovers per game that they actually that they create, right? So they've only made 5 turnovers. They're fifth in the league with 0.79. And if you remember, the Eagles are 0.75 fourth. So they're only one place apart when comparatively in the NFL.
Right.
And so what that tells me is this Chiefs offense does not make mistakes. They may not put up flashy numbers, but because they don't have to. It's a team that we've seen. It's very similar to, I feel like, how the Patriots have been, where they don't need to do these crazy offensive performances. And Mahomes, like Brady, is certainly capable of pulling out magic. And that's what you fear when you play a quarterback of that stature. But they don't make mistakes. That is the biggest thing. They just don't make mistakes, and their defense takes care of business. So that is by far their best attribute for this offense.
Speaking of things that are green, if you're already stressing about your lawn this spring, head over to our friends at Green Lawn Fertilizing. They can help. They're based right here in the Philadelphia area. These guys are the experts in this region's conditions, including PA, New Jersey, and Delaware. They know how that tough drought was last year and created a custom blend and approach that will help your lawn recover. Everybody remembers last year, it looked like as dry as the desert, just one brown lawn after another brown lawn, no rain. It killed neighborhoods. It made our beautiful lawns look, well, not so beautiful. So be sure to sign up now and receive 10% off at Green Lawn Fertilizing. And I'm told this is a very limited time offer. So head to the link in our description or greenlawnfertilizing.com/inside-the-birds to take advantage. You got to be stressed out? Be stressed out about Jake Elliott lining up for a 55-yard field goal in the big game. That should be the only thing you're stressed about this season. Call Green Lawn Fertilizing today.
But that creates a really interesting matchup here in the Super Bowl because the Eagles defense, which has been great all year long, and I want to ask you about their turnover stat because you have them at 1.8 turnovers per game for the season. But again, you mentioned that you felt that you had to incorporate the playoffs. This is not just the regular season. Well, they forced 9 turnovers in 3 postseason games, which I would think has inflated that number. I don't know if you also did the regular season versus the entirety of the season, but I feel like that number got inflated by how well they've done throughout the playoffs against teams that clearly turned the ball over at a rate probably over expectation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it did inflate the numbers for sure. But again, it doesn't tell the story of this team because if you remember in the beginning of the season, the Eagles didn't do a great job of turning the ball over. And I think there's been a huge evolution of this team. And that's why I thought you can't. And I think there's been an evolution on the Chiefs team too. And I just don't think you can tell the whole story without factoring in this postseason, which is why we made that conscious decision to include both. But with the Eagles defense at the 3rd best in the NFL, I mean, they're good at creating turnovers, and they don't just create turnovers by mistakes of the other team. Like, I think that is a huge point of this defense. And I believe that the Commanders acknowledged this in some of the press conferences, how the Eagles did a really good job at forcing turnovers. It's not just they capitalized on the mistakes of players. And that's a big evolution of this team, is they're able to take advantage of poor fundamentals of teams in just, carrying the football a little bit loosely and other ways that at least create these turnovers and create opportunities to steal possessions. And that's a very key point. It's a win condition for the Philadelphia Eagles.
Right. And so the interesting for them is, can they continue to do that against a team now that is just known for, as you said, playing smart, protecting the football? The Eagles have, you're right, not accidentally caused turnovers. You see they're punching the ball out. I'm sure that Andy Reid and the offensive staff is really honing in on that throughout practice this week. Like, hey, if you catch the ball, we can move the ball. I think that's the thing that we'll talk about with this Eagles defense. There are always voids and zones. And I think Washington and Jaden Daniels actually had a good game plan to be able to make that short pass, find that intermediary route. They never forced anything down the field that you thought was going to get maybe one ball. I remember in the corner that he tried to get to either Brown or McLaurin that got hit. But for the most part, they were willing to be methodical and deliberate. The turnovers killed them. The Chiefs, they live by methodical and deliberate. So that really makes this an interesting matchup. And as far as the rest of the Eagles defense, you have a lot of green numbers here, and I think people get that, right? I mean, they're top 3, if not top 5, in their top 3 in points per game allowed, yards per game allowed, turnovers created, rushing yards 8th. So that is the quote-unquote lowest ranking for them. I don't know if that necessarily means you can run the ball. I don't think Washington did a very good job of running the ball against them, at least effectively. At this point, I think, Sam, what the data shows is that you're hoping to play the Eagles. You're hoping to have an honest run game, but you're really going to have to be able to hit the middle of this of the zones when they play zone.
Yeah, and I do think those numbers are somewhat skewed as the beginning of the season, because I think that the Eagles didn't have a great job of understanding their personnel on the defensive line, and I think they've really understood who they have at that position, and honestly, the linebacker core as well, which has turned out very positive for them. But at the beginning, it was kind of there was some learning that had to be done of what they're capable of, who the personnel was, what the optimal personnel is. And I think that's only gotten better throughout the season. So I think particularly with the rush yards allowed, that has evolved throughout the season in a favorable manner for the Eagles.
All right, good stuff. Let's move on to the common opponent, because this had to be really fun for you. I think when we did this 2 years ago and you published it, there were not this many common opponents to have this much data to be able to analyze, right? The Eagles and Chiefs have played 8 common opponents together. So that probably, how did that help you as far as really coming up with comparable data that you found really useful?
Sure. I think first off, it thank you to the NFL for scheduling the NFC East and the AFC West both playing the AFC North and the NFC South. So that's where those 8 games come from. They both played those 2 divisions. They were the 2 that were scheduled. And I think there was only 6 last time. And that came from even the playoffs. We had to find numbers from that. But this was actually like coming from the regular season, which is, I think, super helpful. It was a fun analysis, except for the 2 games, the Falcons and the Buccaneers, that I had to reanalyze. But there's a lot of good information here. But I also want to acknowledge that it's imperfect information because, like I said, both teams have evolved. So we're looking at a snapshot in time, right? That's kind of what this analysis does, is tell us a story from back then. And what we're trying to do is project from that snapshot what's going to happen. And it's always difficult when there's been so much dynamic change for both teams. So I think you have to take that with a little bit with a grain of salt, but I still think it's an interesting and helpful analysis.
Yeah, no, I mean, the first thing that would jump out to me, right, are against the common opponents, the Chiefs are 8-0, the Eagles are 6-2. So if you're using that as some kind of barometer for an edge, well, you have to remember that the 2 losses the Eagles suffered were against Tampa Bay, which anything to me that happens before week 4 becomes less, I guess, pertinent to the conversation because, as you mentioned, that's not the same Eagles team. Ever since they came out of the bye week 5, they have been a completely different defense and offense. So again, the common opponent loss there would be the Bucs, and the Eagles lost to them in week 4, and the Falcons, of course, was the week 2 loss for the Eagles in that. But again, after week 5, common opponents, Eagles beat them all, and the Chiefs beat them all,
which makes it a very fun Super Bowl match. And we'll see going through the data. I think we'll just start going through the chart. And,
I was going to ask you, because you have so many different categories, which of the ones that really jumps out to you as something that really tells a story?
Yeah, I think that a big one that I would like to highlight is third down percentage. So the Eagles are able to convert, which was a little bit surprising to me, at 47.17%. And the Chiefs have been able to convert at a lower 45.19%. And the Eagles have allowed a 42.57% third down for the opponents. And the Chiefs have allowed a 39.8%. And I think, just in my mind, third down is so important because it's how they sustain these drives, right? And I in my head, I thought the Eagles allowed a much higher percentage than what the data actually showed. And they actually completed a higher percent than I expected as well. So that I think that's going to be a very interesting battle, and I think that's going to be a very interesting point to kind of hone on. And this, to the same degree, I think fourth down is very similar, right? The Eagles have converted at 69.23% in these common opponents. The Chiefs have converted at 87.5%. That's almost as automatic as you can get. They both have allowed. Well, the Chiefs have allowed less than 50% at 46.15%, and the Eagles have allowed 53.85%. So it's about a coin flip that they're allowing. So those are going to be 2 really interesting points, and I think it goes to that overall narrative of these sustained drives, and I think that's going to be super interesting.
Yeah, so if you're trying to make a data-based deduction, you might say situationally, as it pertains to third and fourth down, the Chiefs have excelled against common opponents a little more so than the Eagles, and in some degrees, numbers that are a little bit surprising.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What's the one that really jumps out to me is the Chiefs on fourth down. I mean, you said 87.5%.
Yep.
And so this is a matchup of 7 for 8. This is a matchup of 2 teams that are considered 4 down teams, meaning like if it's fourth and short, fourth and medium, and they're on anywhere, I would say plus 60 or even minus 60, right? If they're on their own 40, depending on the down and distance, you're probably going to go. If it's 4th and 1 and the Chiefs are at their own 44, they're probably going to go for it.
Yeah. I wouldn't be.
And get it based on their stats.
Right. And based on these stats in those games, there's been 8 games, right? They've gone through it. at least average. Like, this is probably not exactly, but they've gone for at least once every game, and they've gotten it almost every single time. So situationally, Fangio has to call a defense that limits those stops. And I think that's going to be a big point in this game that could decide in either way.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, situationally, I think is situationally when two teams this good come together, it's usually about third down, fourth down, and red zone. Did anything jump out to you as far as red zone percentage?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I was hoping we could get to the little red zone action.
Well, if you remember, Sam, last game, again, you look for little things that were different, right? The Chiefs got 2 red zone touchdowns off basically the same play, just different, I think, different side of the field and different player. It was, what's his name? He did barely play Sky Moore off a misdirection on the left side. And then after the punt, it was Kadarius Toney off the misdirection on the right side. Both of them, I believe, inside the Eagles 10, if not 5.
Yeah, that is true. And I do think this defense will be a little bit more disciplined this year.
Certainly.
And no shot to the Gannon-led defense of 2022. But I think that this team, because it's, especially since it's on film now, and that's Andy Reid loves it. I think that was called corn dog, the play that actually scored. I think the Eagles will be able to respond to that better. Now, will Andy Reid cook something else up differently? I'm sure. But I really think this Fangio-led team is different and has a different philosophy, even though it's from the same system, having the originator of this scheme. He probably isn't the originator, but the one who, taught Gannon everything, I think is important. But let's talk a little red zone. The Eagles were 16 for 29 in the common opponents at a 55.17%. And they allowed their opposing teams 52% at 13 for 25. The Chiefs, on the other hand, were less than 50. They allowed less than 50%. Their opponents were 12 for 26 in the red zone at 46.15%. And they themselves were 18 through 34 at 52.94%. What that suggests is that the Eagles' offense handled the opponents a little bit better, but the Chiefs' defense handled the opponents a little bit better.
Yet another sort of like the turnovers, right? I mean, your strength versus our strength here.
It's going to be certainly very interesting to see these teams compete. I think again, strength good on good. That's what you're going to see.
This ain't the little itty bitty teeny tiny bowl. This is Super Bowl LIX. Get in on the action at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of Super Bowl 59. Scoring touchdowns is key to hoisting the Vince Lombardi Trophy, and you have a shot to score big by betting on them at DraftKings Sportsbook, the #1 place to bet touchdowns. New DraftKings customers can bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. So download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code BIRDSPREGAME, all one word. That's code BIRDSPREGAME for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5 only on DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly on behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort. 21 plus age and eligibility varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. New customers only. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. For additional terms and responsible gaming resources, see dkng.co/audio.
Yeah, the number that jumps out to me, Sam, and I bet if we did a deeper dive, it would be even more fascinating, right? Is the Eagles defense allowing 13 touchdowns on 25 red zone possessions? Because what really jumps out about their defense this year, I feel like high red zone, they did a really nice job. And that started week 1 against the Packers, even when they weren't playing great defense. Low red zone, much different story. In fact, I think teams have passed the ball well on the Eagles' low red zone using rub routes, trying to get C.J. Gardner-Johnson isolated in man coverage. That started pretty early, and we saw it throughout the year where whether it was, again, rub routes or corner routes, anything like that, if they can get man-to-man matchup low red zone and get the ball out quickly, they're usually successful. But I would also say I feel like most offenses nowadays score at a high percentage of a clip when they're inside the opponent 5, no matter how good the opponent is defensively.
Absolutely. And I think that would be such a fun analysis to do, looking at high, low, tight, red zone, and all to figure out where those numbers actually come from. And
I just gave you your next project, brother.
There you go. I love it.
Good stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
What else in this chart? And, again, this will all be available on InsideTheBirds.com. And we're not going to go through every single category, but I see a lot of green here on the Eagles side. I see a lot of red here on the Chiefs side. So is anything between yards or passing yards or rushing yards that jumped out to you that you think that there's a big disparity?
Sure. I think we should talk about the Eagles' strength, which is that rushing attack. And I think a great place to start is just rushing yards generated, right? So the Eagles' offense has generated 1,228 rushing yards against the common opponents at 4.67 yards per carry. The Chiefs, on the other hand, against these 8 opponents, have generated 978 rushing yards at 4.08 yards per carry. And just that number is pretty staggering in and of itself.
That's huge.
Yeah, they generated 300 plus more yards, the Eagles did. But I think it goes even further when you look at their defense, right? So the Eagles only allowed 850 yards at 4.05 yards per carry, but the Chiefs allowed 908 yards, which is only a margin of 70 for them, right? So they generated 978, but they allowed 908 at 4.88 yards per carry. So what that suggests is if the Eagles can get in a position to run the ball, they should be somewhat successful. And I think that's kind of what we've seen in the playoffs for the Chiefs too, is you can run the ball against this team. So, and I think that's a huge point.
It's almost like the Eagles' running game has become what the NFL is used to with a passing game, which is it can grind you because that's what the NFL passing game is these days. It's really hitting you, and then bam, getting the explosive, bam, getting the explosive. Well, that's what the Eagles' running game is now. And your data here shows that it's been sustainable all year. It has hit you in a variety of different ways, right? Short runs, middle runs, and then bam, the big run. We've all seen that from Saquon. But it's also allowed them it puts the defense on the sideline, gets them a breather so that then when they come on the field, they're fresh and they're able to stop the run. That's a huge disparity to be able to say we ran the ball for 1,228 yards, but against common opponents. Again, this is all based on common opponents. But we only allowed 850 yards to those same teams the Chiefs played, whereas that huge discrepancy is at least 300 and some odd yards, right? For the Chiefs, it's 70. That's the difference between rushing for and rushing against. So that's a pretty big advantage.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's why I think it was definitely worth highlighting here. And you don't necessarily see that same advantage in the passing side of it. But you do see it, interestingly enough, in yards per play. And I think that might be worth just briefly talking about. The Eagles have created 5.54 yards per play, and while the Chiefs have created 5.29 yards per play. The Eagles have allowed 5.03 yards per play, and the Chiefs have allowed 5.33 yards per play. So the Eagles have an advantage in both. They're creating more yards per play, but they're also limiting less yards per play on defense. And I think that is, I think that's indicative of this team, right? They're really good at creating plays, but they're also really good at limiting them. It's a very balanced and talented team on both sides of the ball.
Absolutely. And really what this particular yards per play, which is a very important statistic because that counts everything, right? Against these common opponents. It also shows, while you have the Eagles in green on this one, the numbers are not they're not overwhelming compared to what the Chiefs are doing. I mean, you're talking about 5.54 compared to 5.29, and then 5.03 compared to 5.33. Those are good margins, and they certainly give the Eagles an advantage at that, but it's not like it's a clear landslide. We're so much better at doing this versus them than you are, or we're so much worse at allowing this versus them than you are. And that really kind of illustrates how close this matchup is.
Sure. And I think if they were a huge margin, they wouldn't be in the Super Bowl, to be honest with you. So I think that we're getting this good on good because both teams deserve it and both teams are going to show out, and they have shown out all year. And so I think credit to both teams for creating and limiting respectively.
All right, great stuff. That is part one here of our analytics-based series with Sam Finkel, where we're looking at all the data and all the analytics for the Super Bowl matchup, Super Bowl LIX, between the Eagles and Chiefs. In part two, what we're going to do is sort of move away from the overall how do they do against common opponents, how they do this year, and really take a look at the most important part of the game. As we know, for both these teams, it's who wins in the trenches, or how they measure up in the trenches. And you have some excellent data there, and I look forward to going through that with you on the next episode. So that'll do it for this first part one of Inside the Birds Analytics with Sam Finkel. We'll catch you on the next one.